Process profiles was a term which we introduced into BFO sometime between the release of version BFO 1.1 and BFO 2.0. And you can read about it in the documentation for BFO 2.0, which is at this link. And it has quite a long section on the topic of process profiles. But although I am still an advocate of process profile as a term which it can be used for good ontological purposes, and indeed must be used for certain ontological purposes, there were problems which the various people, particularly Alan, complained about. And I guess you can summarize the main problem as being that people just didn't know when it was appropriate to use process profile rather than process. And process is always safe. So if you don't know, then if you use process, you can't go wrong, because every process profile is a process. And so by some means, which Alan can tell you more about, process profile was dropped from BFO 2020. I am not going to make a case here for adding it back into BFO because I'm not sure that that is the best solution. I will offer instead a compromise solution, which would involve common core ontologies, and it's good to see that there are some CCO people on the call also. All right, so one of the reasons why we can't let it go completely is because lots of people like to use it, including me. So I'm not building ontologies which have process profile in them, but people that I am in touch with almost on a daily basis are using this term. And so the compromise that I am likely to support, and assuming that the Common Core world agrees with this, is that we create in CCO, in the CCO suite, a tiny sliver of a top-level, mid-level ontology. So it's the top of all the mid-level ontologies. I don't know what to call it, but the increment of BFO which doesn't quite make it into BFO, or BFO plus, or BFO plus minus BFO, all of these could be starting points for finding a good name for this thing. And then it would be a ragbag of terms like capability, process characteristic, which I think Alan is going to talk about next week. The term aggregate is defined in BFO at the moment for object aggregates, but there's no reason why we shouldn't have terms for quality aggregate or process aggregate or site aggregate. This is an example of a site aggregate. This is Orlant, which I spent some time in my youth, and it's halfway between Finland and Sweden, and it has a Russian embassy for complicated World War II reasons, but it's not really a country. Oh, I see. So then I need to go back to my screen share. Resume share. So so I need to stop sharing, it looks like. Can someone and try now? No, I still need to stop. How can I stop sharing so that I can start sharing? New share, there. Can you see that? Okay, good. So I'll just give you the slides that I had. So this is the title. Now I can use the full screen. Okay. All right. So then I described the history of process profile, why it's always safe to use process, and then I proposed creating a new tiny storehouse or save ontology in CCO, which would contain terms like process profile, but also other terms that a need for which has been recognized. And then I talked a little bit about site aggregates, including Orlant, which is my favorite site aggregate. All right, now the background to introducing process profiles, as indeed to introducing site and many other terms in BFO, was the geospatial informatics or geospatial information science. And the original version of BFO was created in conjunction with work I was doing on GIS with David Mark and others. And this was also connected to work by linguists, computational linguists, who were interested in understanding the ways in which we can represent spatial reality, both by means of language and by means of diagrams of various sorts. And this is the favorite diagram from that community. It's a four-dimensional diagram. There's a dimension of space and a dimension of time here. There are also dimensions of number of people not yet dead in Napoleon's Grand Army, so that the orange is the way to Moscow and the black is the way back. And France is on the left and Moscow is on the right. So a simpler version of this idea, namely that we have diagrams or charts or maps which represent parts of reality, is a temperature chart. So a temperature chart is like a sentence. It has a truth maker. And then the question is, what is it that makes this temperature chart true or correct or accurate? And a process profile is the answer to that question. So John, actually, his name was Ringo. Ringo has a history of changes in his temperature going all the way back to the beginning of his existence. We measure those changes accurately and create a graph. And then the graph represents in the world just Ringo's temperature over a certain time interval. It doesn't represent anything else. The label represents Ringo. Ringo has a history which is a spatiotemporally extended collection of everything which goes on in Ringo, in that spatiotemporally defined space which Ringo occupies at different times in his life and which moves around in space. The history of Ringo is the history of all the things that happen in that spatiotemporal, I'm not sure what to call it, snake, I guess is a good word. And there is a tiny sliver within that snake, which is Ringo's temperature during this particular 6-hour segment of time on his 43rd birthday. And that tiny sliver makes true this chart. And that tiny sliver is a process profile. That's the idea. So process profiles are tiny slivers of typically much larger processes, which are picked out cognitively by people when they create time series graphs like this one. That's the basic idea. Now, of course, there can be fatter and thinner process profiles. So this is a heartbeat, two heartbeat process profiles, one of which captures much more granular information than the other. And this is my favorite picture in process profile picture land, which is the Wiggers diagram for the cardiac cycle of the left ventricle. And this is a diagram which presents over time the aortic pressure, the atrial pressure, the ventricular volume, the electrocardiogram, which you saw on the previous slide, and the phonocardiogram, which you hear when you listen down a stethoscope. Now, this is a tool which cardiologists use in order to assess where problems might be in particular patients. And in order to make assessments about where those problems might be, in other words, to diagnose those problems, you need to focus on different tiny slivers in the entire complex process, which is the heart beating of a single patient. And then you get a Wiggers diagram. So what do these charts represent? Well, they don't represent processes as we normally conceive them, for instance, the beating of a heart. Rather, they represent those tiny slivers within those processes, which are represented by charts like this. And another example of a real world but very complicated process would be the entire activity on the Dow of all shares which are part of the Dow Jones industrial average calculation for a 15-minute sliver of time, all of which contribute to making this diagram a true chart of changes in the Dow. And this represents then a sliver in that totality of changes, which is created now not just by cutting out some dimension in a full process, but rather by using mathematics in order to create some kind of average of this process. And now, so we have standardized notations. The English language is a standardized notation, but we have a standardized notation for writing musical scores. We have a standardized notation for choreography and so forth. And now these standardized notations do not represent everything which is going on in the process which their notation causes to be created. So if we have a score for a symphony, and then if we look just at the stave for the second violins, then that stave is a process, represents a process profile of a particular performance where the whole symphonic score would represent a much less thin process profile. Maybe we could say it represents the full process of the performance of the symphony, but the single second violin stave represents only a process profile within that full process. The second violinists know that process profile very well. They live and breathe it every day. Some listeners who are particularly interested in hiring one of the second violinists or promoting her to be a first violinist only listen to that particular process profile. They hear all the rest, but they focus on just the second violin performance. And now that's a feature of process profiles. They are that which human beings or other organisms focus on in the world when they are paying attention to processes of different kinds, sometimes with the aid of special standardized notation, such as graphs or scores, and sometimes with just by listening carefully to what's going on or watching carefully what's going on, and only looking at the behavior of the quarterback of the Philadelphia team and not looking at anything else in the whole game. Now, you are listening to me now. You're not listening to the very, very tiny rumble of your laptop or to the very, very faint noise of weather in the background. You're just listening to me now. The language production, which I am now causally responsible for, yields a process profile, which will be recorded and then it will be repeated as another process profile, and so on. This is, I'm not sure. Say it's a crash on the Dow Jones, and this is the blue strand running through the middle is representing a process profile of this sort of thing. And in fact, it's exactly the sort of thing which is inside the oval there. So process profiles are indispensable if we're to understand all of the important things which go on in the world at any given time, whether it's music or stock market changes. And so that is the top, you have a picture of a crash, and the bottom you have another picture of the crash. Both of them involve representations of process profiles. And this is real. The stock market really did crash. And this represents the process profile of John's coronary heart disease over a given period. And now you can see that we can assign classes to different parts of process profiles. And we talk about process profiles. We draw charts of process profiles. We use them in diagnosing and so on. So the process profiles are a product of a quite common cognitive process called cognitive profiling. And I don't talk about view sheds, although this would be an additional characterization of some of the more interesting process profiles. So a view shed is an area of reality. It's a spatio-temporal area, I guess, which is visible from a certain point. So if you imagine a closed-circuit TV camera, which is overlooking a certain junction where there is a red light, that TV camera has a view shed. That view shed profiles a certain area of space and records all the things which happen in that area of space, which are of a sufficient granularity to be captured by its resolution. That would be an example of a process profile. And so cognitive profiling can be performed also by devices of various kinds. And now, many process profiles are qualitative. So temperature process profiles are qualitative. They just track the value of a certain measure at certain times, and it's a qualitative measure. It measures temperature at different times. And we talked about music. So when you listen to music, you ignore the sneezes and the coughs, or sometimes you're just there to listen for the sneezes and coughs because you're the orchestra doctor. I don't know. That you can pick out different things. All right, so now there are many, many ways in which we create these things automatically. So this is language here. And so there are syllables, phonemes, and phonetic units at the top, and then there are various different kinds of spectrum displays at the bottom. Each one of these things represents a process profile, and the green and the orange lines there represent more granular process profiles. And this is more of the same. This is more of the same. The line at the bottom is interesting because these are brain scans which go hand in hand with people saying Waldo or other words. And so all of these are process profiles of the very same tiny event when people speak single words. And now I want to say that speech as a whole, all of spoken language, is a process profile. So speech exists because process profiles exist. Speech exists because we are able to cognitively profile the noises in our environment and pick out only those which are speech processes. And the pulse rate process is another process profile which exists and which is important for doing things like cardiology. And so this is the result of an experiment which shows that they could work out what sound was being created when particular brain scans were being collected. And so that we have now two kinds of process profiles. One is the speech profile, and the other is the brain profile. So the profile captured in the, I wish I had a good word for this, but we will say viewshed of specific electrodes attached to the patient's brain. And here the viewshed is the area of the brain which the electrode can pick up signals from. And in picking up those signals, it profiles those signals and enables them to be represented in these pictures. All right, so biological pathways are process profiles. So there's a huge industry around the gene ontology in finding ways of representing biological pathways and doing inference with those biological pathway representations. And this is an example of a pathway. I would say that all of these pathway diagrams represent process profiles at different levels of granularity, whether cellular or molecular or submolecular. And then all our mental processes themselves are process profiles. So our mental processes, or your mental processes of profiling my speech currently, are themselves process profiles. And you can see in the title for this slide the problem that I addressed at the beginning, namely, people don't know whether to call process profiles or processes. And that's because the process profiles are, in a sense, created by the profiling agent. So you choose what to listen to. You choose what to look at as it changes. You choose what to measure the temperature of. In each case, you create the process profile. You create the process profile by demarcating the region of space-time that you're interested in, and then measuring some value or values within that area of space-time in your mind. That's what you're doing when you listen to me speak, and it's what you're doing when you watch a movie or listen to a symphony concert or diagnose a patient's heartbeat. And now there are different ways in which process profiles are measured. So we've seen a lot of measurement processes relating to language. Language itself is a way in which we measure the process profiles taking place in people's minds. And now just one small proposal, how we might define process profiles, because I haven't really given a definition which would cover all those cases. What the definition I propose would be a very broad one, and I'm not sure if it's not too broad. So first of all, we have the idea of a full process. And in BFO, histories are full processes. The history of you is the sum total, the mereological sum of all the processes which happen in you and in the spatiotemporal region which you occupy. So it also includes all the neutrinos passing through your body at any given time. That's a full process. And if we take just a 5-minute segment of that full process, then we have something that we need a word for, but we might call it a segment of a history. Alan, I think, has a word for this already. And he's free to interrupt. I'm taking the fact that he hasn't interrupted for full agreement. So we have history segments. And now if we profile part of what's going on within a history segment, then that which we pick out by means of our profiling is a process profile. So it has to be picked out. In other words, it can't be the whole full process. It has to be a non-full process, which is a proper part of the full process, a full history segment with which we started. So the full history segment for the cardiologist would be the heart. spatiotemporally determining a certain history segment, the history of that heart for a given time. And then the non-full process would be the atrial pressure during that time, the changes in atrial pressure during that time, the changes in aortic pressure during that time, and so forth. And so we have this kind of chart. So all full processes are processes. Full processing include both histories and history segments, but full process is only one child of process. Another child of process would be partial process or non-full process. And I'm suggesting that process profile is an appropriate word for partial process, where partial processes are defined as non-full processes. This is an earlier attempt at saying the same thing. So a process profile, A is a process profile of B means that A is a proper occurrent part of B, A and B spatiotemporally coincide, and A is non-full. And maybe we want to add an extra clause so that if we say A is non-full, that might mean that A includes parts which are full. And I think we want to exclude that. And so that would mean adding that final clause. And then we can define an instance of a process profile as meaning that there is something of which this process profile, some full process, which this process profile is a proper occurrent part of. And now the question is this a definition? Here I say it's an elucidation, which means that every process satisfies that. But do we want to say that it's a definition, which would mean that everything which satisfies that is a process profile? And there, I don't know. And that is one basis for the skepticism which Alan used to display when the word process profile was used. And he hates the idea, or hated, maybe he's improving. He hates the idea that when a top is spinning, there are two process profiles which we can measure. One is the rate of spin, and the other is the rate of temperature increase. And then Davidson's theory of events. So some of you who are studying philosophy will know all about Davidson's theory of events. I think that Davidson's theory of events is one of the small number of really great contributions of analytic philosophy, because all other analytic philosophers until Davidson came along didn't believe in events. They just believed in objects and predicates. And he created BFO actually because he added what BFO calls processes to the standard ontology. And Davidson is getting at the fact that if you kill somebody with a gun, then there are three processes going on: pulling the trigger, shooting, and killing. And when the murder took place is different. So pulling the trigger may be a millisecond earlier than the actual shooting, and shooting may be months and months away from the killing because he doesn't die immediately. And so these are three distinct processes. They're of course not independent, they're going to overlap. But we can cognitively select those three processes. This may be crucial during a criminal trial, for instance, that we cognitively select different processes. Somebody may argue that it wasn't a killing at all because he would have died in any case from something else. And so it wasn't a killing, it was just a shooting. So it's important. I mean, if you want to take up a criminal profession, it's important that your lawyer is aware of the theory of process profiles. And I mentioned also that linguistics deals with process profiles, that the entirety of phonology deals with process profiles. And the entirety of neuropsychology deals with process profiles. And that's the end. So now stop sharing. And then Alan is not going to be tempted.
Well, I've been chatting some comments in the.
Oh, I see. That created that. If I'd been watching that, it would have created another process profile, which would have caused the main process profile to be somewhat crumpled.
Yeah, one of the pieces of advice I gave was that just because someone says the same phrase over and over again does not mean it refers to anything.
Yeah, that's true. If we take a view that the ontology that we do has a kind of legislative component, then that would mean that we, and I did already do this, but then you pull it back, we could legislate to make it true that when we use the term process profile, we're referring all of us to the same thing, unless we're making a mistake, which is always possible for any term. So I'm wanting you to legislate that process profile is a good term. That's the act here.
Barry, can you speak to for a moment to the you mentioned this in older formulations, but the profile part of the process profile. I've seen you call it kind of a qualitative like characteristic or universal, like is it, but these are not good words, but some sort of like quality that you can abstract from a process.
Yeah. So in the paper which Carter sent round, I believe, which is called Classifying Processes, I identify different subtypes of process profile. And one of the subtypes of process profile is what I call quality process profile. A quality process profile just tracks a single quality like temperature as it changes in a given organism in this case, or anything which has a temperature can have a temperature quality process profile. If you are changing color in the sunshine, then there would be a color process profile, which would be your skin getting darker. And I can go on listing many other quality process profiles. And then there are other kinds of process profiles, some of which are dealt with in the paper. So there are energy use process profiles, which is what you measure when you measure the energy which is being expended by a marathon runner, for instance, during the race. And those kinds of process profiles are very useful, both for the trainer and for the doctor of the marathon runner. And for the marathon runner herself, of course.
May I ask a question to both you and Alan?
You have to ask Alan's permission.
I'm going to do it.
You always have permission from me.
So the full versus non-full process. Yeah. Alan has taken issue with it because, and I agree, the full makes sense. But he's suggesting that the non-full doesn't make sense. And Cameron asked about wouldn't the same apply to fiat or continuate fiat or fiat objects? And Alan pointed then in the chat to the discussion of non-smokers, which is, as I recall, a discussion about defining or what really Merrick misunderstanding the difference between internal and external negation, which I don't think is exactly relevant here, because if that internal external negation issue applied to non-full processes, it seemed like it would apply also to fiat objects. So I was hoping maybe some elaboration on why Alan.
Okay, good. Actually, this is an interesting line of thought which I hadn't considered, but in BFO, and Alan is completely happy with this, although he wasn't always completely happy. We have fiat object parts to be exact, and we need to generalize that idea so that we can have fiat process parts. That's what I'm arguing for, recognizing fiat process parts as being bona fide legislatable citizens or denizens of reality.
Well, the thing about fiat parts is that it's very clear what kind of fiat one makes when one designates a fiat part. It's still an entity, a material entity. It still has a spatial extent. And if it's a material entity, it has a mass. All of these things make sense. So we understand what the fiat act is in that case. In this case, we don't really, because we don't really know what those thin processes are other than the words thin process.
Okay, so let's suppose we take your brain and let's assume that it's an object. And then let's suppose that we take that fiat object part of your brain, which is all the cells, molecules, ions, and so on, which are involved at the moment in you listening to me. That would be a fiat object part.
That's
but
perfectly
it would have
fine.
all
So
the problems
you can
you
circle
raised
those.
with
You can circle those in space and time. There's no problem with that. It's like a better analogy would be to say that that my intention is a fiat part of my brain, but we don't say that, do we?
So that is a very good question. I only say that when I don't know the answer.
Well, Barry, can you back up a second and finish that analogy you were going to make? So the fiat object part to the fiat object, or to the fiat process
Yes,
part.
so the idea would be that when we talk about certain things happening in complex objects like the brain, then whether we're talking about fiat object parts or fiat process parts, exactly the same problems seem to arise. So I don't know what an intention is. I suspect it's a disposition in BFO terms. And now, in what is the bearer of that disposition? We could say that the whole organism is the bearer of the disposition. In the case of an intention by, for instance, a human. But we might want to say that there are only certain parts of the organism which are involved. So the arms and the legs aren't involved. Whatever is involved would be a fiat object part of the bearer. And if we're very careful, we might be able to say, well, these cells in the brain are involved because we can see them moving when this particular intention is salient to the person's consciousness. And these other parts of the brain, which are about food or something, are not moving. And so we can gradually narrow down a certain part of the brain as being that which is the bearer of the disposition. That would be a fiat object part. And now we don't do that much in neurology because the brain is very hard to do surgery on. But I'm sure neurosurgeons do have fiat object parts in mind when they explore particular kinds of mental phenomena which are susceptible to being improved or repaired by means of surgery. So I don't think it's incoherent to say that certain parts of the brain would be responsible for certain kinds of processes, and those parts of the brain would be fiat parts, and they would be extremely delicately thin sliced kinds of parts, which are structurally very similar to, in the continuant dimension, to profiles in fact, to the associated profiles in the occurrent dimension.
So if we say speech is a process profile, why aren't the words on a sign a continuant profile?
I'm willing to go down that road.
Well, generally, we've already said that that's not the case because we talk about qualities and shapes. We already have a theory of that that works well. So this would be just I don't know what. I mean,
okay, good. Yeah, so let's talk about view sheds again. No, maybe not. Let's talk about the quality of the wording on the sign. There is a fiat part of the sign where the quality exists. Yes.
Absolutely, but note the difference in relationship between what we're talking about with process profiles. We don't have a relation of dependence like we have in continuance. We have a relationship of parthood. It's as if parthood
Yeah.
replaces a whole bunch of other relations.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like to say part of is the new ISA,
Yeah. Yeah.
because ISA was overused for many years.
Yeah. And so what's wrong with that?
It's a false explanation. It's a false analogy. You can't.
Yeah, so
You're shifting from the words to the bearer, and you're ignoring the fact that the bearer has a relationship to the shape of the words, namely it's the bearer, whereas we're saying a completely different relationship holds for processes in speech.
Yeah.
It's not the bearer, it's the part. And so by analogy and continuance, we'd have to say that the wording, not the material bearer of the wording is also a part of a continuum, a very thin part.
Yeah, but there is a very crucial distinction between processes and continuance. Processes are such that they have all their parts as a matter of necessity. Continuance can lose their parts. You can lose hair. You can lose a leg. Processes can't lose their parts. So if this, I'm not sure, this presentation is brought to an end because Carter pulls the plug suddenly, that doesn't mean that the process changed. It means that the process, which would have been the full presentation, was cut short. And so the full presentation never happened. That's not true for continuance. If we pull out some of your hair, you still go on existing.
You can't pull a part of an electron and still have it existing. That's not a universal truism about continuance.
That's a long story.
So may I ask Barry and Alan and John? You seem to say, "Oh, it's very clear what the full process is." Well, it isn't. Can you, for me at least, can you explain what you understand by a full process? And I ask it specifically because his first tentative elucidation that Barry made, there is clearly the process, which is the history of the universe. And it seems that everything that happens there, so each of our history is part of that history. So it seems to be that actually all processes are process profiles. But that wouldn't work if you said.
Or rather, all processes are histories.
Well, explain me what the full process is.
Well, what I understand Barry to mean by full process is basically all the things that are happening inside a certain spatiotemporal region. And that's how we define histories. Histories are a good example of full processes because everything that happens, so to speak, within a spatiotemporal boundary, which is you, is your history. And the definition for that is chosen specifically so that it's clear that there's a one-to-one relationship between you and your history.
But is that in the axioms?
Yes. That there's a one-to-one relationship between you and your history, yes.
Oh, yeah, that it is, but that it's everything that happens in a spatio-temporal region.
It's the definition.
But it's not axiomatized.
Well, to axiomatize it, we'd have to do things like quantify over all fiat parts of processes. And I've thought of doing that. I just haven't implemented it. I think that it can be implemented. It's sort of like you have to do a sort of a comprehension to identify all the things. And we don't always, and it involves, for instance, the assumption that you can always take a spatial fiat part of a process, for example. That would be an axiom that we have to depend on. We depend on that implicitly. So not everything that can be axiomatized is axiomatized. But in many cases, we have an idea of what direction we would go if we wanted to add more axioms. And in this case, not so much.
So if I could ask a quick question to support Werner's argument, just cast it in this language. take the universe to be the maximal spatiotemporal region, four-dimensionally extended, and then say that, look, any process is going to involve some subregion of that. So it's going to be a process profile of the maximal process of the entire universe.
Every process has to have a spatiotemporal extent. What is the spatiotemporal extent of his heartbeat graph?
Probably it's not a space and time that we have to consider here. So if we have to sum up what I have understood, and correct me in case, usually we understand or recognize processes by their special temporal features. So we imagine worms or stuff like that. But then we have history, so we anchor process with a specific continuant. And in case of process profiles, we're anchoring these processes with qualities or quantities of some kind. So we follow the path of a quality or quantity in case temperature, in case spin, or whatever. So it is a way of segmenting. It is a way of taking and carving out new proper parts in some ways, in this case processes, but the demarcation is given by properties instead of continuants or spatiotemporal segments.
I think that some of the things that Barry mentioned weren't only qualities. First of all, there's an idea that, and I think that Barry has said in the past, that processes don't change, processes are change. The problem with that is that we've never actually axiomatized that. We don't actually identify what a change means, and we don't construct processes out of sets or sequences of those changes. I think that would be a very interesting direction to work on, because right now we don't really define what a process is, or a participation even is, in any kind of let's say way that it can be applied algorithmically. We just sort of brute assert that this is a process and that this is a participant. So I think there's holes in the theory of processes that, if we tried to develop a better theory of processes, maybe something like process profiles would emerge. But we don't have that theory.
Even if processes are changes, aren't process profiles just portions of those changes that we're picking out?
That would be a reasonable interpretation of process profiles if we define processes as sets of changes, which we don't.
So let me say something. So first of all, Werner's point doesn't hold, because the process profile stands to the corresponding process, according to the definition that I proposed, in such a way that they share the same spatiotemporal region. And so cutting a collection of processes by making it only those processes inside a certain subregion of the entire region of the universe, then we're not creating a process profile. We're creating what we might call we're creating a fiat spatiotemporal region, and just looking at the history of what's going on in there. So we're creating fiat histories. And that may be a useful term to add. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we do have the theory of change. It's not very mature, it needs help, but the theory of change is the common core ontology theory of stasis. Change is non-stasis. And we should be working on...
Another negative definition.
Yeah, but it's a theory, and I think it's...
and stasis is a theory of unchange, if anything. And actually the definition we've given... The definition we've given for stasis, the only one that actually corresponds to BFO, is to say it's a history during which something doesn't change. And so by basing it on history, we have a clear grounding, so to speak, of it.
Okay, so then you're using the word change in that definition. You say you approve the definition, and so we need to hear what you have to say about change. I don't have anything against an ontology of change. But I haven't seen one, and I think that the theory of process profiles is it's slightly different from a theory of changes. So a theory of changes, it seems to me, is an ontological theory. There are changes in the universe even independently of the existence of cardiologists or people who do brain scan measurements.
Right.
But there are process profiles only in a world in which we have cognitive agents who select thin slivers of processes for particular diagnostic or scientific purposes or entertainment purposes, and they want to make good films. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of happy for process profile not to be in BFO, but to be in the tiny sliver of BFO, of non-BFO, called BFO plus, or whatever we call it. It's like capabilities. There are no capabilities in a world without humans.
There are very few roles in a world without humans. There's plenty of.
I know, but
and there are no fiats in a world without humans. So we already have that in BFO.
I know. So do you want us to change all the URIs for role and fiat object parts?
No, I think that we have theories of what those mean. We've talked about them for many years. The thing that's not axiomatized about fiat part is just that the designation of that part is a fiat process, a process which involves a human. We just haven't axiomatized that.
Yeah.
But we can. Anyway. In the same way that roles come into existence by certain kinds of processes that give birth to them, fiat parts come into existence, or their designations come into existence by certain types of processes. The other thing about what Barry's saying is we make lots of information things that we look up for diagnostic purposes. What we don't understand here is why we have something which is many of those pictures are information, right? They're measurements. What we don't have is a necessity to identify what that information is recording with something called a process profile.
I just made a suggestion to that end, actually, in the comments for how we might get a one-to-one between, in this case, some GDCs and process that might track the history material object one-to-one.
So my idea is that we need truth makers for Wiggers diagrams. And process profiles are truth makers for Wiggers diagrams.
So are the electric potentials, which happen to change in time. But at any given time, at all times, the truth maker for the potential is the potential, not a profile. It's not clear why you need an extra entity that extends these things over time.
Because we're usually interested in sequences of electrical potentials.
We can certainly be interested in without positing a new kind of entity.
So do you believe in poems or symphonies or?
Sure.
Okay, so then you believe in process profile.
No, I'm pretty sure I don't.